series. As you all know, that EGROW Foundation is a research-based policy think tank in NCR region. We have been discussing and working on contemporary policy issues. In the last 2 years of COVID, we have taken the advantage of getting the best minds from across the world to come and speak to us. We have been fortunate to have two Nobel laureates, and I would say two potential Nobel laureates in addition, who have come and spoken to us on various issues. We have tried to maintain a balance of 50-50, 50% Indians working in India and 50% scholars working abroad and speaking to us. It is in that very context. Today we are fortunate to have Dr. Nirvikar, Professor Nirvikar, come and speak to us. To chair the session, we have Dr. Arvind Virmani, our chairman of EGROW Foundation. As we all know, Dr. Virmani was the chief economic advisor of our country and then the executive director at the International Monetary Fund, representing India and a few other countries. Dr. Arvind Virmani himself is a well-known scholar, published in peer-reviewed journals. He has books to his credit. He has been working on reforms, including reforms as far as environment and climate is concerned. With this, I hand over the session to Dr. Virmani.
Thank you, Dr. Charan Singh. It's a pleasure to have Professor Nirvikar Singh. We have interacted a long time, I don't know how many decades. My first recollection, may be wrong, was at the Asia Pacific Center of Stanford University, where we used to have these India, US or India discussions. And the other place was, I guess, the India-US academic conferences organized by the NCAR. That's my vague memory, but you may remember better. My memory is fading. But anyway, it's a pleasure to have you here. So let me formally introduce Dr. Nirvikar Singh. He is distinguished professor of economics at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he also directs the Center for Analytical Finance. And I just heard from Dr. Charan Singh that Nirvikar has also been, has had dual charge. He has also been professor of religion at the university during some period. He has also got extensive experience on India. As he mentioned, I mean, he has books on India. He has followed it, and my interaction, as I mentioned in the beginning, has been at many of these conferences. So I know he's been a devoted student of India for a long time. He has also been a member of the advisory group of the Finance Ministry on G20, a consultant to the CEO, the Chief Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance, and also a member of the expert group of Government of Punjab for revitalizing the state economy. So with that, over to you, Professor Nirvikar Singh. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Virmani, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Dr. Charan Singh, for inviting me. I'm going to see if I can get my screen on and okay, so hopefully you can see the full screen, and I'm going to speak on India's strategy for achieving net zero. This is essentially trying to give you an overview of the issues and how India can move forward. And it relies a lot on the work of other people who I will mention shortly. So let's see if I can figure out how to advance. Okay, here we go. So sorry, I'm trying to, I'm not familiar with Cisco. Okay, I'm just trying to, okay, here we go. So, so why are we concerned about net zero? And maybe that is where to start. And really, this whole framing of issues is part of the serious concern that we have with climate change. And the recent sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change basically said we face catastrophe from rising temperatures unless we make significant new efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And here, of course, by we, I mean not just India, but the whole world. So what is net zero? The idea of net zero is that one needs to offset new greenhouse gas emissions with other actions to supposedly make net emissions zero. So the idea is that we can't reduce emissions to zero completely, but there should be some ways of compensating for emissions, for example, by just to give you a very simple example, planting trees or something like that. The 26th Conference of Parties that signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and that was back in 1994, a generation ago, made some new promises at the 2021 meeting, and this is an annual meeting. This was where pledges of net zero became commonplace across most countries. At the 2021 COP26, many countries agreed to the goal of achieving net zero by 2050, and India pledged to do so by 2070. Why did India choose a later target date? Because it is still relatively poor, and its historical cumulative emissions have been relatively low. So it's understandable why India would choose a different end date or target date. So this is we're looking at 50 years ahead, which is quite a long time to try to project and plan for. And so this is going to be a very complicated challenge for India, as it is for any country. But what I want to do today is to emphasize what I think are the key features of any strategy that India is going to follow has to follow to achieve net zero. So this question, how will India achieve net zero by whatever date it chooses? In brief, it has to greatly increase the role of cleaner sources of electricity generation. That is, I think, everybody accepts that, but what I want to emphasize is that that is really, really the centerpiece of anything that India does. And secondly, electrify industrial production. So one is electricity generation, and the other is the use of electricity in industry. And obviously, those two are going to go hand in hand. Now, again, just to give you an overview of what I want to emphasize in terms of the key features of what India's strategy has to be. For cleaner energy, solar will be by far the most important source of cleaner renewable energy, and I think that's something that I will explain in some more detail shortly. I also want to argue that an accelerated target may be possible without sacrificing growth. And of course, this is absolutely crucial for countries like India. It will be very difficult politically to say that, okay, we're going to meet our emission targets, but as a result, we're going to sacrifice the material well-being of our citizens, of India's citizens. So what I'll suggest is that to achieve an accelerated target, one has to look at some additional components of strategy, and I think the one to emphasize is carbon capture and storage, and that would be specifically for coal-based power plants and industrial production. So I have actually a complete paper which I'll be happy to share. Actually, it's after I agreed to this talk and uh, before today, the paper has actually already been published in the journal Energies, and it's open access. So probably I can just provide the URL to the EGROW Foundation for anybody who's interested. But in the course of writing this paper, I drew on a lot of expert work, and here I've listed just a few of the studies which are specifically focused on India. And these studies have detailed projections and simulations and a lot of data. And all of that is necessary. But what I want to do today is to look at all these studies and extract what I think are the key components of a strategy for India if it's going to achieve net zero. So let's now go back a little bit and try to understand why I'm making these points about how India can move forward. So India's per capita energy consumption is less than 40% of the world's average. It relies very heavily on coal, which is a significant challenge for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. For transport, oil is the most important, and for residential heating and cooking, biomass is the most important. In a lot of the analysis, I'm just going to set aside biomass, and some of the data, the government data also reports figures without estimates of biomass. And I think a lot that is also partly because, this is things like village cooking stoves, so it's very hard to quantify. In any case, I think we can really put it aside for to talk about the key components of what India's strategy should be. So of the total final consumption of energy, industry accounts for the largest share, 42%, and that is followed by the residential sector, that's buildings and so on, and then transport. And of this total final consumption, right now, electricity accounts for just over a quarter. So that's actually a relatively small portion of energy consumption. So another important number is the current electricity generation capacity. Actually, I only have the figure for 2020, and that was 455 gigawatts. And of that, 10% was hydropower and 1.5% was nuclear power. And I would suggest that neither source affords much scope for growth in capacity for various reasons, very different for hydropower and for nuclear power. But I'm not going to say any more about these two sources, even though they are a relatively clean source of energy. So in 2020, solar and wind power capacity was about 20% of the total, or 90 gigawatts. And the Indian government estimates that the short-run potential for these two sources of renewable energy is about 1,000 gigawatts. But just to give you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of energy capacity, net zero by 2070 will require 8,000 to 9,000 gigawatts from solar and wind. So that's 20 times the, that's 100 times the current capacity, solar and wind. Now that seems quite hard to get one's head around. 100 times. But we have to remember that this is over 50 years. So actually, the growth rates are not that unbelievable or infeasible. The projections suggest, and here I think I'm relying particularly on Chaturvedi and Malyan's predictions, based on their model, and other people have slightly different numbers. But out of this solar and wind, solar would have to be 75% of that. And I think it's fair to say that solar has some significant advantages over wind in terms of location and variability and so on, reliability and so on. So basically, what we're saying is that to achieve net zero by 2070, solar has to go from just much less than 90 gigawatts to something like 75% of 9,000, so 6,000 or 7,000 gigawatts of capacity, and that would be 60% of India's total capacity. So what we're talking about is India growing over the next 5 decades by very heavily investing in and expanding solar power generation. This has to be a major strategic thrust for India. Now, let me say a little bit about other aspects of the transition strategy. One of the reasons why these models really emphasize solar power is that solar is close to being cost competitive with coal. If we include storage costs, it's maybe a little bit more expensive than coal, but I think the difference is sort of within a margin of error, and there's still, I think, some room for greater efficiency in terms of solar power. So I think, aside from saying what India should do, the point to be made here is that this is economically reasonable strategy for India, focusing very heavily on expanding solar power capacity. One very important point that we have to emphasize, and in some sense this is independent of net zero targets or anything else, India needs to upgrade its entire power grid. This is, I think, one of the weakest spots of the Indian economy, and I think it has been for decades. It's been a struggle for India, but I think there's a lot of potential for upgrading the power grid as one expands generation capacity. And I think a lot of optimism comes from the fact that new digital tools, including artificial intelligence, are now available, and they'll play an important role. One of the main obstacles for the last few decades, of course, has been the political economy problem of state-run, state-level power distribution companies, and there's going to have to be a way of solving that problem. I don't know exactly what it is, but I think if one is talking about expanding capacity for growth, including solar power, and making the power grid more efficient, one really has to tackle this political economy problem. So my thinking is, if the government can privatize Air India, it can solve this problem. I mean, that was, I think, one of the biggest problems that it faced, and it has done it. So another aspect of the transition strategy will be the electrification of road and rail transport. And of course, this is already well underway. Again, I think what I want to emphasize is that this is going to be a very large-scale transition, and it will need extensive new infrastructure for charging stations, batteries, production, and so on and so on. So again, this will require a lot of strategic focus on the part of the government. And when I say the government, it's not always that the government has to do things directly, but of course it has to make the playing field work for private participants as well. I think another very important part of the transition strategy will have to be in building design and construction. And here standards will be very important, and digital tools of a completely different kind will matter here. So essentially, we're talking about energy efficient buildings, and within energy efficient buildings, efficient use of energy through digital technology. And again, I think this is underway, this kind of transition. It just has to be done much more with a lot more strategic intent, I would argue. Just to give you a very simple example, the government's push to replace traditional bulbs lighting with LED lighting has been very successful. So here I've been talking about India's official target of achieving net zero by 2070. And I think it's fair to ask whether India can achieve the target by 2050. And looking at the standard strategy, the strategy I've described so far, achieving net zero by 2050 doesn't really seem feasible because it would require reduction of the use of coal to something like 5% of what it is now, or of India's total, and that would be just too rapid and dramatic a reduction. So the central problem in accelerating the transition is what to do about coal. And as I just noted, replacing coal as a power source for this is not practical. It would have very high cost to do it as rapidly as would be needed. So here, I think the argument is, and again, I'm borrowing from others' analyses, is that one should consider developing carbon capture, utilization, and storage at the project and plant level. And I think this is a relatively proven technology. It's still not quite as cost effective as it needs to be, but I think this is where, again, some serious policy attention needs to be given. And there are other ways of, other components of strategy that could be. I think somebody has their.
Hello, please mute yourself. If you're listening, please mute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Virmani. So, there are other technological innovations that India is exploring, and other countries are exploring. One of the main alternatives is green hydrogen, and that I think is from my understanding. I'm not obviously a scientist or technologist. My understanding is that this is still much more uncertain in terms of its development, and so I would argue that if India wants to consider the possibility of an acceleration of its target of net zero by 2050, that green hydrogen is something that should be explored, but it shouldn't be a centerpiece. You can't rely on it. But I think carbon capture, utilization, and storage is much more promising. So why should India consider accelerating the transition from 2070 to 2050? I think there's a strong case to be made because many of the costs of climate change will be local and regional. And India is among the most vulnerable nations to climate change. So what I'm suggesting is that a lot of the benefits from an accelerated transition will actually be not just global, but also local and regional. And so from that perspective, India should consider a more aggressive strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I think there are also large benefits from reducing air pollution. The carbon capture strategy, which reduces in particular particulate emissions associated with the use of coal, would provide very significant health benefits to India's population. And this is a tricky intertemporal optimization problem. I would argue that accelerating the transition may bring down cumulative costs by reducing investments that will eventually be undesirable, because as India grows, if it is sort of taking its time to transition from coal and other fossil fuels to green energy sources and developing alternative infrastructure, I think that investment will become prematurely obsolescent with the later date, even with the later date. So one might as well move those investments forward and consider an accelerated strategy. And what I would suggest, and here, I'm being quite a bit speculative or conjectural. I think this acceleration may be achievable without growth costs if it's suitably funded. So what I would argue is that, thinking of it from a global perspective and India and sort of fairness and equity and so on, rather than India saying that it should have 20 more years to reach net zero, it should argue that it wants to achieve net zero by 2050, but it needs global funding. So the way to I think tackle the fairness issue is not to slow down the transition, but to have more global funding of India's transition. So turning to these kind of issues, the economic issues, and how the transition is going to work, I think electricity pricing and carbon taxes need careful policy attention. This is actually quite a complicated issue. It's not as clear-cut as some people, even economists, have argued that, just have a carbon tax and everything will be fine. Actually, some recent work in the United States shows that setting standards can be even more important for incentivizing behavioral change than changes in pricing. And I think looking at it from the perspective of avoiding disruption in the economy and preserving India's growth, I think subsidies also need to be used. There's a rationale from an externality perspective and an equity perspective. And as I've noted, some of those subsidies should be coming from advanced countries which have contributed the most to the current situation, the current problem. Now, there are some estimates of what kind of energy sector investments are needed, and those run from 2.7% to 4.5% of current GDP. That percentage will actually come down as India grows, so the long run annual average is below 2%. So 2% of GDP sounds like something that is quite manageable, but putting it in a different perspective, India's tax to GDP ratio for the center and states combined is about 18%. So if we're talking about all of this coming from public investment, obviously that's not going to be feasible. India cannot divert 10, 15% or 20% currently of its expenditure simply to energy investments. And you can look at the pattern of public spending to see that just won't work. So investments would have to come not just from the public sector, but from the domestic private sector and foreign direct investment and multilateral and other foreign assistance. And what the exact mix is, I think one can discuss. But clearly, I think one has to make an argument that again, the advanced countries, either directly or through multilateral agencies, have to take more responsibility for enabling countries like India to have a successful green transition. So I think India has a very strong case for such assistance, especially targeted to accelerating the transition. And the strong case comes from the fact that it has contributed very little to cumulative emissions, and it is still well below the global average. So in conclusion, I think India can argue that its historical record and current situation with respect to emissions give it slack in terms of meeting net zero targets. But I think there's an alternative case that an accelerated transition to net zero by India with well-targeted global support is optimal for India and for the rest of the world. So if properly strategized, this can likely be done without reducing future economic growth, only changing its nature. So what we're talking about here is not less growth or slower growth, but a different kind of growth. And that, again, requires strategic planning right now and strategic investments right now. And what I've tried to argue is that the strategy requires relatively few areas of focus, in particular, rapid electrification and a rapid expansion of solar power capacity. And the rapid electrification means a very serious attention to upgrading the power grid. Now, there might be some scope for, with solar power for, decentralized mini grids and so on. And maybe those will also be, cost effective in a larger context. But I think eventually one would like to have even those mini grids being able to connect to a larger, more efficient electric grid. So India has not been known for strategic focus, and I think in that respect, I think it's fair to say that China has tended to do better in that way. But I don't think there's anything to stop the Indian government from doing that. I don't think it's a necessary condition of democracy that one lacks strategic focus. And I think it's a question of policymakers kind of deciding what to really throw their weight behind. And there have been other examples with, for example, welfare schemes or increasing educational enrollments where strategic focus has yielded results. So I think an accelerated approach also addresses criticisms that net zero targets ignore transition paths. The point being that if one is talking about achieving net zero by 2070, that's so far in the future that we'll get another 20 years or 30 years of emissions that are too high to protect the planet. And I think an accelerated approach would really kind of move forward that by moving the beginning of the transition forward much more would really address criticism of net zero in general. Now, net zero has other issues about greenwashing and trying to pretend that you've actually done something where you haven't. I think those are valid issues, but I think the idea of a net zero target, I think, is again a very good one because it just creates a possibility for strategic focus. So you have a finish line, and your goal is to how to get to that finish line. And what I've argued in this talk is that one can get to the finish line maybe more quickly than we think, and that there are just 2 or 3 things that need to be done very well in order to get to that finish line. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you so much, and I think we have time for Q&A. I will stop sharing.
Thank you. Okay, let me start off the by kind of combination of comments and questions, 3 or 4. So first is, of course, the issue of cost comparison. I have heard recently in the last few months a speaker say that solar generation is now very not just competitive with coal, but effectively that even a private sector person will not set up, if you offer or you have a let's say, contest, what do you call it, a bidding process, that nobody will set up a coal plant, that the economics have changed so much. So that's the first thing. What is the cost? What is the trajectory? Can you tell us a little bit more about the cost comparison of solar with alternative here is coal? So that's the best thing to compare with.
Yes. So again,
I'm going to put down 3 things, or you want to go one by one?
Okay.
Can you note down or?
Yes. Yeah. No, I'll sure. Go ahead.
Because so also the same person said that if you include storage, which is the macro question, so there's micro, that if you are bidding for electricity, and then there's the micro storage question, which, just for information, some of our listeners who may not know, it's because you have to match the demand pattern by the supply pattern, and the supply pattern of solar is completely different from coal. So you have to have storage, right? Which you assumed, I guess everybody knows, but that's the key. So you can't really switch over wholesale or large majority to solar unless you take care of the storage issue. I'm just elaborating for our listeners here. So on these 2 cost comparison, we'd like a little more. Second, you talk about design and construction. Now, in our India Vision paper, EGROW paper 2050, we try to spell out meaning indicate, and it's good to have deeper information, and which is what my question will be. But one of the things one talked about there was the whole issue of exactly what you mentioned, building design and urban design. So in this context of your point, can you, do you have examples? Do you have, where, let's say I want to learn about this and propagate it in India. Can you give us some pointers? Are there X and Y country is doing this well or whatever? Okay, so some a little bit more deeper or concrete on that particular issue of building design, urban design, and so on. And the third one, which is very tricky, I will accept if you kind of ignore it, but there is a very difficult balance between a pattern of investment and a pattern of obsolescence, which obviously depends on the pattern of innovation. And just to make it a little more concrete, when these oil prices arose because of Ukraine, which was totally unexpected, people have said that you went too far. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just trying to tell you where I'm coming from. Is that, because everybody, the Democratic administration, etc., was talking about clean energy, climate change, etc., that companies cut down their investment in oil refineries and oil discovery. And therefore, that is the reason. Again, this may be half truth or quarter truth or whatever, but there is that issue, right? So I'm taking off from what you said, that it's really, to me, in the longer term, in the framework you are talking about and we are all discussing, it's really a question of investment pattern and pattern of obsolescence. But when you talk about obsolescence, then the issue of where this technology is coming from is also comes in. It's okay, we need not go into all the aspects. But I just want to mention that Indian government is aware of this issue, and which is why it's so keen in promoting battery production, the PLI scheme, etc., so that one knows and has some control about how this technology progresses, how obsolescence happens, how it integrates with investment. So complicated issue, but if you have some thoughts, you can mention it. That's the third one, which are the 3 main ones. But on the fourth one, half in jest, we abolished the planning commission, so no more planning for us. So I don't know where that's going to happen. But in my time in the planning commission, these are things we focused on very systematically. If I had been in the old planning commission, this is exactly one of the topics which would have been on my agenda for doing some planning on and going through all these issues which I have raised and which you have raised. Anyway, so why don't you answer these, then we'll open up the floor for others.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Virmani, for these very perceptive questions, very important questions. And I may not be able to do a very good job of answering your questions, but let me try. So on the cost of solar versus coal, what I was trying to say is that the current estimate suggests that once you factor in the cost of storage, solar is slightly more expensive than coal. But what I also suggested is the difference is not too large, and it's within a margin of error. And it could certainly be that that relative cost could be reduced quite quickly as adoption of solar increases. So what I would argue is that all this means is that there's no uncertainty with respect to solar. One can, with a lot of confidence, really push for expansion of solar power capacity, as long as the investment in storage capacity keeps pace with that. So the second question about building design, and what I really appreciated was that you also added city design. So it's not just individual buildings, but also the design of the entire urban infrastructure. And I think with respect to the latter, I think actually India has a very good tradition of incorporating green areas and so on, and I think that can be built on. Sometimes it's just focused on in showcase cities like Delhi, but it can very easily be that kind of expertise can be transferred to many other cities in India. India's second-tier cities are very large, right? I mean, we have urbanization is going to be very important in India. With respect to individual buildings, again, these are very technical issues, but with respect to building design, I think in particular, the size and placement of windows and the use of building materials, I believe that these are areas where standards can easily make a difference. And just to, I mean, the examples I'm more familiar with, honestly, are from the United States, where one has a different kind of construction, right? These are wood frame houses. But what the United States started to do after the 70s oil shocks was to basically just raise the standards for the insulation that goes into that dead space between the exterior framing and the interior walls. And that's a relatively cheap solution, which has a tremendous impact on heating and cooling costs. So, when one is talking about brick and concrete in India, it's a slightly different situation. But I believe there's a lot of potential innovation in building materials in India. And it's a question of, again, once you set standards, it gives industry an assurance that there will be demand. And what you see is then an expansion of supply. And I believe that's what one saw with LED lighting, for example. The third issue of intertemporal, for some kinds of investment, there is a lot of uncertainty. But again, I guess the reason I was arguing for an accelerated investment was, again, because I think a lot of the transition is going to come from is going to be supported by an expansion of solar power. And as we discussed in my answer to your first question, solar power is ready to go. It's now a mature technology, and speeding up the adoption of solar power is something that I think will get us to a point where we can avoid investment in new coal power plants or anything like that. Your fourth point about planning, I think one always has to have some kind of strategic planning. I think the what happened was that we replaced one kind of institution for planning, namely the planning commissions and 5-year plans, with a different kind of planning institution, which is Niti Aayog. And one obvious difference, of course, is that Niti Aayog doesn't make decisions about allocation. So it's more of a think tank. But if I can say something, which is purely my opinion, from observing Niti Aayog, I feel like it has become a really good think tank. It started out slowly, but I see some really very powerful stuff coming out of Niti Aayog, for example, in terms of things like artificial intelligence strategy for India and so on. So I think there's a lot of scope, a lot of, I think, optimism I have in terms of India's ability to formulate and execute strategic ideas.
Okay, thank you. With that, because we'll run out of time soon. So yeah, so first Charan, and then if Dr. Vishandas wants to come in, then we'll open it up for Dr. Charan Singh.
Yeah, Professor Nirvikar, thank you very much. But then I had a few questions. One is, Professor, I have lost track and good listening to you. I thought for some time we were pursuing nuclear energy, which is a very clean energy, and I don't know where down the lane it's just fallen apart. We haven't heard about it in the last 7, 8 years. The second, you're right, solar energy has come off the table now, but when I have been trying to use solar energy kits myself, I found them still very expensive despite the subsidy being provided. I was wondering, India is pretty rich in wind energy, and we do not find much windmills in our country, whereas there are countries we do enough research on windmills. I've also seen miniature versions of something like windmills, which are in the heart of the city and traffic roads, and they generate lots of energy, and which is sufficient for places around that high traffic roads. Even that's not been experimented. I'm not sure if experimented rest of the world, but certainly not in India. Ocean wave technology at one point was showing promise, and I do not know where has that withered away. I don't read or hear much about it. The last point Dr. Virmani made was very important on urbanization, style of urbanization. And my own thought was urbanization then becomes a center for high power consumption. So would, and your own thoughts on the wood houses in America. In Kerala, we had Laurie Baker who was experimenting with local material, but he would say not more than 2 floors. That was, I thought I lived in some of those houses in Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum. I thought those were very good and did not, in the heat, the warm weather of Trivandrum, they were able to handle the situation well. The last point, Professor Nirvikar, I have been thinking about, and I'm very worried in India, we have quite a bit of fashion invasion from rest of the world. That means there are fashion brands which are coming into India, and our youth and young have almost taken to those fashion brands in a big way. The fabric is not used from India, fabric comes from outside. But then the issue is, this fabric, is it suited for the climatic zone, climatic conditions in our country? So these brand names like Zara, H&M, M&S, and Tommy Hilfiger, the fabrics are from outside. And therefore, one of the things I keep thinking is that does the use of fabric also lead to high consumption of power in AC? And is there a way we can, on one hand, we shift to solar, but or other alternatives? On the other hand, we conserve. While we talk about housing material urbanization, we also talk of the fashion that would need lots of space. Thanks for these, and if some of these would you would like to comment on, more than happy to listen to your views. Thank you.
So
Yes.
just to add a couple of, just to add, I forgot to mention, the urban, very important. We actually had a paper, me and a scientist, friend of mine, on what we call natural cities. which was published in EPW. So anyway, I think Charan, we should put that, make it available on our website, because we are getting so much into environmental things, we might as well put that somewhere.
Sure, sure.
Anyway, so that is one, but I think what Charan has emphasized, the local material. So again, you know, the question, a very important point. You know, there was a period of spurt of innovation on using, he mentioned Laurie Baker, etc. But one of the questions which comes up now, you know, in 2022 is how do you combine kind of old materials, local materials with modern technology? Because, you know, and this whole innovation process. So this, how to stimulate innovation. I mean, you mentioned some of the things, subsidies, etc. But anyway, so please go ahead and answer whatever part of Charan's questions you want to comment on.
So Charan, you covered a lot, but let me try to give brief answers. So, no, you're right. I think at a very small scale, solar can still be not very cost effective. Though I'm seeing that start to change in the US. But I think what we're talking about when we're talking about solar generation is really, solar farms at sufficient scale. So I think that's where the real growth will come from. With solar versus wind, the projections I've seen are, that India should be aiming for 3/4 solar, 1/4 wind. And so I chose to focus on solar because I felt like that's where the real, one has to really get the 10% growth per annum. Wind, I didn't mean to ignore wind. I think wind is an important component. I think it's going to provide just proportionately less of India's renewable energy needs, but it's going to provide a significant amount. And you're absolutely right that there's a lot of scope for developing wind power. It's a little more variable, a little trickier, I think, but certainly very important. With respect to building materials, I'm not an expert. I think there's a lot of scope for innovation and setting standards. I'm not sure, setting limits on number of stories and so on is the right way to go. Sometimes one can get too aggressive in terms of restrictions, and one should really focus on what really makes the biggest difference and not do too much micromanagement. I think the point about fashion is really interesting, and I think illustrates some of the other challenges we face. I think from my perspective, the problem is not so much the type of fabric, but the usage of fabric. And actually, what is a huge problem now is this trend in the West of wearing something and throwing it away or giving it away after wearing it a few times, which is a completely wasteful way of using resources, right? So I think that has to change. And to the extent that well-off young Indians copy that, I think that would be a disaster. We come from a generation where we wear the same shirt for decades or the same shoes, So I think there's a value to being frugal in terms of how we use things that we have already produced. There are also issues of ecological issues of mining and so on associated with the materials used in solar and so on. And so there's a lot of complications which I've kind of glossed over. And again, what I wanted to do in this talk was to say that basically stress the positives and say we can actually make a big difference. That a green transition actually doesn't mean poverty. It actually
okay. Thanks. Yeah, you'll have to be brief. Let me next turn to both the questions and the answers now. I think we are running out of time. So, Dr. Vishendas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me an opportunity. I must congratulate Professor Nirvikar Singh for giving a masterful exposition. because of paucity of time, let me be very brief on my question. In India, agriculture allocates about 142 million hectares for agriculture in terms of the geographical land, and there are few crops and the cropping intensity is also low. So can we do on a very large scale planting the solar tree in such a manner that photosynthesis for the crop does not get obstructed, and still at the height of about 12 to 15 feet we can plant say about 500 solar tree in per acre, or about 1200 something like this, on a large scale across the country. What do you see the prospects and what it requires to replicate this and scale up this? Because there are very sporadic kind of experiment being done, but what's your view on this?
Thank you. Just very briefly, I think there's a lot of potential for innovation in agriculture. I think actually a lot of that innovation has to come in more efficient water usage. Also, I think cropping patterns need to change. But I guess the reason I was focusing, not really talking about agriculture, is because as India grows, and a lot of that growth will come in industry and urbanization. And so I was not giving so much attention to agriculture, but there's a lot. I totally agree that there's a lot that can be done in greening agriculture as well.
Thank you. Looking at some of the questions on the chat box, number of people seem to be interested in our linkage with pollution. So if you want to elaborate a little bit on that, carbon capture, pollution, that sort of thing, probably
Sure, yeah.
clarify.
No. Basically, coal-fired power plants and coal-based industrial production are a major contributor to particulate air pollution, and it's been documented that it has very severe negative health impacts. So my point was that to the extent that carbon capture takes that, so the idea is that you're not replacing coal plants, but you're equipping them with equipping them so that the all those greenhouse gases and the particles are both taken out of the atmosphere. And then of course you have to do something with that. But what you're doing in reducing greenhouse gases through carbon capture at the plant level is that you're also dealing with particulate air pollution, which is a good thing.
Thank you. There's a question, Mr. Sameer Chawla, but I should just mention the other. Mr. Chawla can go next. Raised a hand, but there's also the same question on nuclear, but I guess you already answered that. People seem to be concerned. There used to be a lot of emphasis, or talk at least, where emphasis is a bit vague on nuclear, and somehow it's disappeared. But I guess Charan has already asked you that question. So, Mr.
Well,
Charan,
sorry, I forgot to answer. Let me just say, I think that nuclear can't grow fast. Excuse me, grow fast enough to deal with India's green transition. Plus, I think the risk-reward calculations. I mean, if you build 100 nuclear power plants in India, I don't think it'll work. 100 more.
Okay, Mr. Chawla, you want to ask a question? Your hand, I see your hand up. You're muted. You'll have to unmute yourself.
My question was on nuclear energy also.
Okay, then we've already answered that. He doesn't really have more to say. Charan, any other question which you can repeat, and then we can. Do you see anything in the chat box which we missed? I think it was basically solar, nuclear. We've had all those questions.
Right. We have almost covered everything. There was one question on should the government provide more incentives to encourage solar energy?
Right.
I think they should.
Right. So no, I will just reframe that question. You had given certain policy suggestions for your whole thing. Can you just repeat them for people who may have joined later or missed it?
So I guess very broadly, I think India has to focus very quickly on expanding solar power as a source of electricity, and also an infrastructure for electrifying road and rail transport. And I think the policies have to be a mix of taxes and subsidies. And I think there's a very strong case that advanced countries and multilateral agencies should be stepping up their funding of India's green transition, just both from an equity point of view and also for optimizing the global green transition.
Right, I guess that sums it up. Infrastructure, standards, subsidies and carbon taxes. I think that was the main recommendations. Okay, if that is all, I thank you and thank we had a very good audience actually. I'm surprised a lot of people are getting interested in energy. In fact, you're matching the number of people who was here for Montague's talk on reform. So looks like more people are interested, or as many people are interested in green future as on reforms. But anyway, thank you, Nirvikar, and for all the people who participated. With that, over to you, Charan, to conclude the session.
So I must thank the chairman to have sat with us and discussed this issue, and Professor Nirvikar to have agreed to come and speak to all of us on such an important issue, net zero. His article, I saw it and it was very interesting. And he's going to send us the link when we put it on the Twitter. We'll add the link along. We'll have the recording available to us by tomorrow noon. So I'm sure many of us are going to use it. As I mentioned, I'm going to use it in my class for children to understand where we are heading for. My students, 120 of them. Next week, I'm happy to say Professor Robert from Kennedy School is speaking to us about manufacturing and trade. In same time, so I would invite all of you to please pair and discuss and enrich the discussion and participate in the discussion next week, Friday, on September 9, Professor Robert from Kennedy School. So we'd invite all of you to please come and participate and enrich the discussion. With this, let me once again thank each one of you. We have experimented with late night, and I think we have been successful. So most of the foreign speakers we'll probably accommodate around this time. See you all next Friday. Thank you very much today. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.